All for joining us today. I'm Spencer Overton. I'm a professor and the founder and faculty director of the Multiracial Democracy Project here at GW Law School. We focus on solutions that will facilitate our nation's transition to a well-functioning multiracial democracy here. We've got a couple of big initiatives. One is focused on alternative electoral systems. And we're working with about 15 civil rights groups to understand the racial implications of reforms like proportional representation, fusion voting, Final Four primaries. Our goal is to be prepared if this U.S. Supreme Court continues to scale back Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. We're also working on AI and multiracial democracy. Shoot me an email if you want to learn more about either of these projects. So today, I'm thrilled to welcome you all to our third installment of our Democracy in Color series. We've had great turnout and fascinating discussions with our webinar so far. We've now got a YouTube channel where you can find our previous webinars. Our goal with this webinar series is to create a space for thought leaders from philanthropy, the academy, media, to really come together, consider the role of ethnic identity in the 2024 presidential election, and generally as a data point in thinking about how we build a well-functioning multiracial democracy. So before I introduce our speaker for today, I want to deal with a couple of housekeeping items. Our next webinar will be held on Friday, March 21st at 12 noon. We're thrilled that Professor Zoli Heinl, he's a professor of political science at UC San Diego School of Global Policy here, and a great, outstanding political scientist. He's going to talk to us about racially polarized voting in the 2024 election. We'll resend that invite, but I wanted to flag it for you. I also wanted to remind you that we're going to record the entire session, including the interactive conversation. Now, we don't want a chill discussion of sensitive items. So if you'd like to ask a question, but you want to remain anonymous, just send your question or comment directly to me in the comment box, and I'll indicate and indicate also that you want to remain anonymous. I'll read your question or comment to the group without mentioning your name. Otherwise, please just chime in and ask Professor White questions. So now, our featured speaker for today. We're delighted to be joined by Professor Ismail White. He's a professor of politics and public affairs at Princeton University, where he studies American politics with a focus on Black politics, public opinion, and political participation. He recently co-authored a great book called Steadfast Democrats: How Social Forces Shape Black Political Behavior, which explains the maintenance of Black unity in party politics through the establishment and enforcement of racial group norms of political behavior. His research has really been widely published and widely cited. He's won a number of awards here. He serves on the board of the American National Election Study. He'll be present today, and he'll present for about 20 minutes. Then we'll have an interactive conversation. Before I turn it over to him, though, I just think it's incredibly timely to hold up. Number one, he's a good friend and has been one for a long time. And I want to just hold up for you a publication called 50 Years of the Voting Rights, the State of Race in Politics. Right. We worked on this 10 years ago, and next month, the beginning of next month, only really a couple weeks away, we're going to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. And that publication we worked on together, Zoli Heinl worked on it with us as well, really shows the trajectory in that 50 years of kind of race, polarization, politics, in the 50 years since the Voting Rights Act. And so, I look back on it, Ishmael, just with pride in terms of high quality product that you all
Yep.
put together. And it was a real, substantive, there were a lot of very symbolic
Yeah.
things 10 years ago that were great. But,
Yep.
just kind of the substance of, okay, here's what this means in terms of our politics.
Yep.
That was the document. So thank you so much for your leadership then, and thanks for being here today. I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Spencer. Man, I can't believe that was 10 years ago. Wow. Time flies. But yes, it was great. And it was also great to go to Selma. I mean, that was a wonderful experience. So thank you for helping us to do that. I mean, that was great. Um, well, thank you, and thank everyone. I want to thank everyone for showing up. Today, I'm going to talk briefly about Black voting in the 2024 election and beyond. Let me start by saying that much of what I will talk about today is preliminary and sort of based on the highest quality data available to me. In a few months, we'll have a much better sense of what happened in November as states release turnout data and polling firms sort of finish up post-election polls. Um, if you know anything about elections, you know that it takes a little while for the dust to settle, as they say. Or maybe I should say the mud, right? Anyway, um, so if you paid any attention to any president, can we, the next slide, sorry. If you've paid any attention to any presidential election for the past 30 years, you're probably familiar with what I would argue is the most reliable media storyline during election time. And that is that this election is one in which Black Americans will break with the Democratic Party, right? This storyline never fails, right? It's there nearly every election. And what often happens is one poll or another finds some difference, and boom, there are 15 stories about how Black Americans are shifting to the Republican Party. And the 2024 accounts didn't disappoint here. As you can see here are just a sample of such stories. This election featured a bonus storyline about Black men breaking with the Democratic Party. Now that the election is over, we know we can be pretty certain that the demise of the Black American Democratic voting bloc was greatly exaggerated, as it is every 4 years. While we know that such accounts get clicks, we also know that the storylines can lead to greatly exaggerated predictions that could potentially impact the outcome of the election. Now, I'll say a little bit more about this at the end of the presentation about what I mean about impacting the outcome. But today's presentation will go over a few examples of actual heterogeneity within Black American political preferences and show that many of these differences, while real, are very small, and in some cases, so small and inconsistent as to be meaningless, especially when we couple them with turnout differences and propensity of different groups to turn out. Throughout the presentation, I will point out which patterns of Black political behavior I think might be the best indicators of actual shifting commitments among Black voters. Before I start the analysis, let's first say something about data. Assessing Black political behavior is difficult because most public opinion polls either have too few Black Americans to make reliable inferences or collect data from online samples, which often overweight young voters who are less likely to turn out. And as you will see, these young voters are also slightly more likely to support Republican candidates. And yeah, can we click to the next one? Okay, one more click. One more after that. I guess I had a lot. Um, the 2024 CES is one such non-probability sample, which I think kind of exaggerated the potential for Black support for Donald Trump, showing that about 25% of Black voters and over 30% of Black men said they would vote for Trump. And we know this was likely too high, but this is an interesting survey because it's a very large survey. I mean, it probably has upwards of 3,000, 4,000 Black respondents. The problem is, again, it's a non-probability sample where people are sort of opting in via the web. Next slide, please. So let's begin. I will discuss a little bit more about some of the data as we go, the data I'm using here, but let's begin with turnout. If we click to the next slide, please. All right. Yes, perfect. And keep clicking. Turnout is notoriously difficult to measure in surveys, partly because people lie about turning out, and partly because the type of person who agrees to answer a survey is also the type of person who's likely to vote. Thus, a better way, or maybe a somewhat better way to sort of get at turnout is through examining state voter records. These have their own problems, but at least the problems are roughly consistent across years. Here we see turnout for Black Democrats and white Republicans in Louisiana. Louisiana, like many southern states, is racially and politically polarized, meaning nearly all the white residents are Republicans and nearly all the Black residents are Democrats. And I will use Louisiana here mostly because of data availability. Louisiana is one of the first states to sort of release their data. We also use it because, like many VRA, Voting Rights Act states, they keep turnout records by race. What we see here is what I think is perhaps one of the more telling stories about this election, and that is the turnout gap between Black Democrats and white Republicans. Here we see a roughly 20 percentage point gap between the groups, between these groups, and a 5 percentage point decrease among Black Democrats from 2020. Now, while we realize Louisiana is not a swing state, we do see similar decreases among Black Democrats in other states with large Black populations, such as North Carolina. And although there are only a few white Democrats in Louisiana, it is important to note that their turnout also decreased significantly. So this preliminary data, we think, suggests that the Democrats may have had a turnout problem, right? Unable to get out their core voters. But again, we need more data to make more, conclusive assessments of whether turnout was what's driving this. Yeah, perfect. Outside of turnout, small shifts among key demographic groups can further sort of exaggerate these turnout disadvantages, especially if they occur within large subpopulations. Here I'm going to explore the effects of some of the most discussed cleavages within the Black community: gender, age, education, partisanship, and ideology. You can skip to the next slide, please. To examine these differences, we'll turn to data from two sources: the Princeton-Jackson State National Election Study, which was a probability sample survey of 4,000 Black Americans, and the ANES, which many regard as the gold standard for American surveys. I should note that these are pre-election components of each, and that each has a post that has not been released yet. So again, we kind of have to wait until we get that information before we can say a lot more. And I can talk about the methodology in the Q&A if you would like for each of these surveys. So let's start with gender differences in Trump support among Black voters. This was perhaps the most talked about issue as it relates to Black Americans. And that was that Black men were shifting to Trump and the Republican Party. As you saw earlier, some polls found that nearly 30% of Black men said they would vote for Trump. As you can see here, the Princeton-Jackson State election study, which actually had a large oversample of Black men, found only a modest gender gap. In fact, the oversample, you know, there's a challenge of kind of getting enough Black men in surveys. Most surveys you see have roughly 60 to 70% Black women. This survey actually has slightly more Black men than Black women, in part because of the effort to oversample them. But yet there's no real effects, gender differences that we see here. And if you compare these differences, as you see with these gender differences to the differences among white Americans, you see that while the Black gender gap is somewhat unique in that, you know, there is a sort of difference among Black men, there's not a lot going on among whites. And that, as you can see, this difference again is still somewhat inconsequential because, again, it's such a small difference. But by sort of statistical standards, it would be different or distinguishable from one another. It's still only about 5 to 10 percentage points. So if we compare this to white Democrats, we see that although Black men are the most supportive of Trump, it is only by a relatively small amount. So I'll say this, that the gender differences here seem to exhibit, again, some unique qualities that suggest that it's probably something we should be paying attention to. But of course, these differences would have to grow significantly to be meaningful, particularly given the somewhat low propensity of Black men to turn out and vote. Thank you. Next, we turn to another interesting demographic predictor of candidate support, and that's age. Like gender, it exhibits some small but interesting patterns among Black Americans. As you can see here, younger Black voters were more likely to support Trump, but again, only by a very small amount, These differences grow a little bit. If you did it by gender, you get about 15% Black support for Trump among the youngest Black men in the youngest age category. Next slide. If we compare these age differences to white Americans, we see that, or if we look at the same age differences among white Americans and compare them to Black Americans, we see that the pattern is nearly the opposite, right? For Black Americans, support, where we see with whites, younger people are more likely to support the Democratic candidate, while older people are more likely to support the Republican. Part of the reason this is the way it is for Black Americans, I think, is because their support for Trump was already so low that, you know, there's not a lot of movement. You know, there's only one way for movement to go, right? And the people most likely to move would be younger people. So again, this is another difference that is sort of talked about in the media, but, you know, it's not doing a whole lot, but it's also something we should probably keep an eye on as well. Next one is education. Again, we see nothing really surprising here. Maybe the most interesting thing here is that they're really high, are on the really high and low ends. While on average, those Black Americans who have less than a high school education and those who are professionals sort of exhibit the same amount of fairly low levels of support for Trump. But there's some interesting variability or more variability among those with less than high school. This is due to a lot of factors, but perhaps there's some uncertainty about the choice, right? And if you could go to the next slide. And you can see a kind of more exaggerated version of that same sort of pattern here for whites. But for whites, the sort of class difference in education really shows, as you sort of see, that it's those with a high school degree and some college who are more in the two-year college degrees that are more likely to support Trump. Okay, so moving on to something where we actually do observe some real differences among Black Americans, we turn to party. So looking at party identification, we see, perhaps not surprisingly, I guess, self-identified Black Republicans support Trump. There are not a lot of Black Republicans in this sample. Only about 8% identify as Republican. And even among Black men, that only goes up to about 11%, which is, again, and these numbers are not too different from what we've seen in previous years. So note that there's very little support for Trump among independents. This, I think, is an interesting observation. And you can think about it this way. If we're going to see any trend towards increased Republican support among Black Americans, the leading indicators would be first, either or an increase in Republican support, right? Meaning an increase in the number of people who identify as Republicans, or much stronger support among Republicans for Trump, or increased support for Republicans among independents. Now, independents are an important group because, as I just told you, there's only like 8% Republicans here. The 25% of Black Americans identify as independents. So if independents began shifting towards the Republican Party, although we see some little bit of difference there relative to Democrats, there's still not a lot of difference among Black independents in terms of Trump support. Again, you know, party is kind of endogenous to candidate support, so we often want to say, you know, sort of not make too many kind of causal claims about the direction. But if we compare it to whites, we can see a little bit, some sort of more interesting dynamics, I think, as we note that even Black Republican support for Trump is relatively weak when we compare it to white Republican support for Trump. Only 70% of the strongest, the people who identified as strong Black Republicans said they would vote for Trump, while 100% in the ANES of strong Republicans said the same. Now, I'm going to come back to this point because this is part of a kind of bigger story about polarization that I'm going to connect it to in a second. So this kind of lack of predictive ability of these sort of party is kind of even more extreme when it comes to ideology for Black Americans. As you can see here, ideology for Black Americans only weakly predicts Trump support. Only about 30% of strong conservatives said that they were going to vote for Trump. This is totally consistent with past years. I mean, for decades, we've seen this effect, right? That ideology only weakly predicts Republican support. So, and this is all driven, again, by conservative, Black Americans who identify as conservative, not actually supporting Republican candidates. As you can see with strong liberals, none of them are voting for Trump. Next slide, please. And again, just like party, this becomes really clear when you contrast it with whites. There are lots of reasons for this, but one of them is articulated in my book with Cheryl Laird, who's at Maryland, where we argue that social connections to the Black community are what helps to keep Black Americans who have conservative beliefs aligned with the Democratic Party. And so as I wrap up, I would like to explore these differences with ideology and partisanship a little more, because I think they are key to understanding where Black Americans are relative to whites and where we might look for indicators of change or possible change. One of the ways that political scientists think about polarization is through the growing ideological distance between partisans. This is what makes voters and politicians inflexible, right? When Democrats only want liberal policies and Republicans only want conservative policies, right? We can measure this in surveys within the American public by looking at the correlation between these two political measures I just mentioned, ideology and partisanship, okay? As we can see here, among white Americans, as political polarization has grown since the 70s among elites, so has this correlation, right? As you can see here, it started at about 0.3 in the 1970s. Today, that correlation is reaching nearly 0.8, right? This is the sort of era of political polarization, okay? Next slide, please. The interesting thing, however, is that polarization has not grown much among Black Americans, as you can see here, or this kind of polarization. And this is driven by the fact that, again, as you just saw, conservative Black Americans are still voting for Democratic candidates, right? As you can see, in the 1970s, Black and white voters were basically equally polarized in some sense. There wasn't a super strong connection between ideology and partisanship. Can you stay on that slide, please? However, what occurred during this time period, as the Republican Party sort of pursued its Southern strategy, and which ultimately led to conservative Democrats and Southerners in particular shifting to the Republican Party around the 1990s and 2000s. So as scholars of Black politics have been arguing for decades, there exists a kind, so what's going on with Blacks, right, is the question. We've been arguing for decades that there exists a kind of unique Black politics that constrains Black Americans, a kind of understanding that the Democratic Party supports Black group interests. So can you go to the next slide? So that said, I want to bring to your attention, I'm sorry, go back. I still got a few more details on this one. Okay, so saying that, I want to bring to your attention the points for Black Americans before 2008, okay? Before 2008, as you can see, there's a lot of variability in the dispersion of the points, right? So each of these points is a correlation, right, between party and ideology, right? And you see a lot of dispersion between those points before 2008. Now, part of what, but yet when you move past 2008, you see that the points fit nicely with the line, right? Now, part of this is because, you know, part of this is inadequate data in those early years that created some of this variability, as the points I was mentioning about too few Black people in these surveys. And it's definitely true that past 2008, there's this is the American National Election Study. It made a better effort to collect data for Black Americans. But I believe that part of this too is due to the Obama campaign and his time in office, where his campaign brought Black Americans into the fold of contemporary party politics. But I think an interesting thing here is that many of the that once he did that, many of Black Americans began to pay attention or more attention to politics because they followed Obama. Some also begin to realize in this process of paying more attention to politics that their conservative political beliefs were not necessarily aligned with that of the Democratic Party, right? And as Obama disappeared from the spotlight and other charismatic figures like Trump replaced him, we're starting to see Republican support and identification among conservative Black Americans, which I'm suggesting is this kind of uptick you see here in the line after 2008. So the evidence, yes, thank you. The evidence for this explanation would not only be this slight increase in the correlation between party and ideology among Black Americans, but would be what you see here, what you see right here. So what is presented here is the 2012 vote among 2024 Black Trump supporters. Okay, so these are people who in 2024 said they were going to vote for Trump, right? But we also asked them a question of who they voted for in 2012. As you can see here, of the Black Trump supporters who voted in 2012, 64% of them voted for Obama, right? 64% of them voted for Obama. So we see this as some maybe suggestive evidence that what is going on is Obama pulled some people into the, into electoral politics, into paying attention to politics, into watching CNN or something, right? And in that process, they realized that their political beliefs, particularly the ones who identify as conservative, were not necessarily aligned with that of the Democratic Party and have continued to engage in politics, but now are many of which are shifting to the Republican Party. Now, again, we don't have a ton of data to support this point, and we need more time to examine this trend, but that's kind of our suspicion. Okay, I think I've gone over a little too long, so I can answer any questions and say more about what this means for multiracial democracy in the Q&A, because I'm curious to hear what people have to say. You're muted.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Even after COVID, I still don't have this down here. So let's open up the queue in terms of any questions here in terms of different folks here. Just either raise your hand or put something in the chat here. And Ishmael, as we kind of start off on that last slide, as we wait for other folks to get in, on that last slide, do you know of those Obama voters who, what's kind of the partisan breakdown of those folks? In other words, are some of those people Republicans who are like, I got to vote for a Black president? To what extent are those people, were they kind of Democrats back then, but now realize they're actually conservative?
Yeah, they're a mix. The thing was that everybody voted for Obama, right? As we know, the support for Obama among Black Americans was roughly 90-something%. So 95 and 12, I think. And so there's not a lot of variation. So if there were going to be people who voted in 2024, who also voted in 12, chances are they voted for Obama, right? But yes, I think most of them are independents, in fact, or identify as independents here. But or voted for or identify, and there's some who identify as Republican, but we don't know what their party identification in 2012 was, right? So we don't know if they changed or if they have the same party over that time period.
Okay, appreciate it. Hey, James, thanks so much for being here. I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Professor White, for the presentation.
Oh, no problem.
On your last slide, one of the places you highlighted was actually storytelling. And I know there's been a lot of conversations about uh, what kinds of information we should be trying to generate as we go forward. Can you talk a bit about sort of for Black Americans especially,
Yeah.
what are the issues or areas that storytelling should try to focus on that you think would gain attention and potentially move people to greater levels of participation
Yeah.
in voting and the electoral process?
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm not sure. So I'm conflicted about so, so one of the things we do in campaigns, and we often talk about when we talk about campaigns, is messaging, right? Uh, but I worry we particularly the Democratic Party, puts too much emphasis on messaging and not enough emphasis on sort of meeting people where they are at, right? And by what I mean is sort of, you know, one of the good things about Trump is that he just kind of gets a feel for where people are, even when people are at their worst, right? And he has a way of appealing to people with that, and that's not necessarily a good thing. Uh, but the Democratic Party, and part of that I attribute to Trump sort of learning about politics from New York City, his time in New York City, right? The New York City machine, right? But machines, that was the thing. That's the thing about machines, and machines were always close to the people, right? That was always the thing. They had a good vibe for the people, and they practiced this kind of patronage politics. And you can see a lot of that in how Trump interacts with his constituents. Um, but these machines used to be Democratic machines, right? And of course, the Republicans shut all that down with all these corruption prosecutions. Many of them were corrupt, right? But there is a thing about machines and their ability to resonate with voters and to be close to the people. And my concern about the Democrats is, there's too much of a focus on messaging and not enough focus on sort of meeting people where they are, and are building institutions at the local level, and that's my take on it. So I'm sorry, I don't have a real answer for how to appeal to people in terms of getting them to turn out. And that's mostly in part because I worry that we focus too much on messaging.
So certainly open while we wait for anybody else to kind of raise their hand. You know, a lot of us focus on presidentials.
Yeah,
Somebody one day said it was something that meant something to me, which was, kind of presidentials are kind of like the Super Bowl,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like all these other elections are kind of real thing, and there are other people
yeah,
who are paying attention, and they're very, very different, right?
yep, yep,
And so obviously this is important in terms of what happened in November, in terms of trends. Anything you and other political scientists are talking about in terms of kind of not just presidentials, but,
yeah,
local elections, state elections, all the other elections for the 600,000, elected
yeah,
offices around the
yeah,
country, and what we're seeing in terms of trends, both in terms of turnout and polarization.
yeah, yeah. Again, I think a lot of the the polarization has created, essentially what are, Democratic and Republican spaces where they're just, the outcome of local elections is already sort of predetermined in many of these places, mostly because of polarization. And then you add race on top of that in southern states where you have this both racial and party polarization. And, you have all these races that are going to be, this perfectly predictable in some way, right? A Black Democrat is going to win in this congressional district in, the South, right? And a white Republican is going to win in this one. And this creates a problem in lots of ways because, the parties aren't, you don't necessarily have real campaigns, right? And how do the parties invest their time and effort? And people just get tired of politics in some ways too. And so I do worry about how polarization has sort of, sucked the life out of American politics. That said, there are other questions about how elections are creating all of the problems we actually have, and we can talk about that, which, and the kinds of structures that might better help minorities to have more political say or to be more empowered.
And what are your kind of initial thoughts about that from a structural
Oh yeah,
standpoint?
my initial thoughts are a little bit more radical than I think even some of the kind of incremental changes, like even proportional representation. I think I worry a lot about elections as the problem, right? I think elections are the problem. How do you get out of elections creating polarization? And there's some people who offer kind of alternatives. Like I read a book a couple weeks ago called Autocracy by a philosopher at Rutgers. It's a very good book. I mean, it makes the case that we should have a lottery system where we bring regular people in to be our representatives, right? And because it's a lottery system, because people would be selected at random, it's going to create a natural proportional representation, right? There's that. Or there's some sort of true minority veto, right? Right? We could have something like that. Maybe a guaranteed seat in the Senate for Black Americans or something, right? It's these kinds of more radical and sort of bold steps, I think, that are needed in order to ensure minority protections of the protection of minority rights. Because majority rule is not going to bring that for minorities by definition, right?
Certainly open in terms of the queue here, to what extent, if we see more, higher income white folks voting with Black people, could different racial coalitions, create systemic change here that's more kind of racially inclusive.
But that's kind of where we are, right? With white professionals shifting to the Democratic Party. And then it's creating this sort of populist sentiment among, working class whites who used to support the Democrats. Now they're all on Trump's, all supporting Trump in part because, they see him as their advocate, right? And because he knows, I mean, he is smart in this way, right? He can read the tea leaves of the public. I do think he has a good sense of that, at least.
So we've got a question in the chat, and questioner, is it anonymous or do you want to come on and ask it? Okay. Well, I will assume that it is anonymous then here. And so if I heard your bottom lines right, one reports about a decline in Black support for Democrats were greatly exaggerated. Two, in fact, the shifts from past support were very small, so small to be statistically meaningless. And three, the
Yeah.
most talked about facet of that there's more support for Trump by Black men in 2024 was
Mhm.
also exaggerated. Is she getting that wrong that, hey, yeah, things were moving in that
Yeah, yeah,
particular direction,
yeah,
but there was kind of a media exaggeration in terms of
yeah.
that, or is that wrong?
Yes, it's so I will say, again, I caveat a lot of what I'm saying in part because we still have to wait for a lot of data to come out, right? But there is data that suggests that those differences that we saw were exaggerated. I mean, the exit polls show that they were exaggerated. But what's important to understand is that every one of these polls has a different set of problems, right? And one of the things, for example, the poll I discussed here among Black Americans um, was a large scale, multi-mode mail text and a mail and text survey, right? Um, but most of the studies that observed big differences among Black men and Black women were online polls that focused on typically used opt-in samples and then reweighted those samples to be representative of the population. Now, that in itself is not problematic, but it does create a certain set of problems in the sense of, one, you don't know who these people are, right? You really don't know who they are, right? The pollster, the companies think they know who they are, but they've not seen these people, right? Uh, this is in part why what we did in our poll, this Princeton Jackson State study, we took the voter file where we knew exactly who all these people were, in part because in states where that require race on the voter file, we knew them. So there's most of the southern states. In other states, we used what we knew about the people in the southern states to estimate a probability of a person having a certain race, right? So we knew that much information, right? And so we were able to get that sense. But again, these other polls don't really have a good sense of who these people are. Some of them do some validation and they may have a sense of like whether they voted, but again, So there's a caveat to all of what I said, but I do think it was somewhat exaggerated in the media accounts. And the media has incentives to do that, obviously. It's just, it puts the voters in a weird position, right? In the sense that they're hearing all this information and nobody's caveating it, right? And so nobody's saying these polls are like not great, it's just information for them, and that may influence how they turn out. It may influence how they even end up voting, right? So
So these trends, not to kind of overread them,
yeah,
but
yeah,
what do you think they mean in terms of multiracial democracy here?
yeah,
To
yeah,
what extent do they mean and allow, people of different racial backgrounds building
yeah,
coalitions, working together on policy,
yeah, yeah.
that kind of a thing?
So I think one way to think about the sort of implication of this for multiracial democracy would be that it depends on how you think about multiracial democracy, right? If you think of multiracial democracy as Black voters have sort of entered into this coalition with white Democrats as a way of sort of ensuring their rights are protected, um, and that Black voters themselves have sort of built structures to deliver votes as a bloc, right, to the Democratic Party. If Black Americans are not able to do this, right, what then happens to Black rights, right? The Republican Party is seeming like it's kind of committed to kind of backtracking on some of, at least to some degree, on some racial progress, right? This is what you see with the anti-DEI push, right? And they're doing this by sort of treating themselves or treating white Americans as a minority, right? When they aren't, right? They aren't a minority, and they most certainly aren't a political minority, right? They may be developing into a numerical minority, but they aren't a political minority. And so it would seem like the idea here is to keep undermining the cohesiveness of racial minority groups to the point that they are sort of unable to kind of deliver for the Democratic Party, right? As this kind of coalitional politics would I think require, you know.
I gotcha. So we have got one more question from Sean Raymond. I'm going to go ahead and read it here. And it's, do we have any data or do you have any hunches about variation among Black voters by age, income, gender, etc., in the value that they place on descriptive versus substantive representation?
Yes. So we do have a good bit of data on this. And so, in fact, I'm working on a new project right now, a new book project on this very idea of what motivates Black Americans to support Black candidates. But for me, you know, this is kind of the general question. And the general question we get with descriptive and substantive representation is, do Black Americans value descriptive versus substantive representation? For me, my question is, I think the kind of more political science question would be, are Black Americans able to hold descriptive representatives who don't represent their interest accountable, right? Because the problem with descriptive representation is when it doesn't result in substantive outcomes, right? But if Black voters are just valuing descriptive representation as an end in of itself, then they wouldn't hold Black elected officials accountable, okay? They would just be like, oh, he's Black, so he's the guy, right? He's adding to what is descriptive, he's adding to, an image that I belong in these spaces, right? Which is a good reason for voting for someone, I think, but maybe shouldn't be the whole thing, right? Anyway, basically what the work we've been doing, and it's complicated because, it's hard to use actual observational data to answer that question because there's a lot of selection problems going on. Candidates don't just randomly run in districts, so you can't compare across districts because you're not comparing apples to apples, okay? So what we find is essentially evidence that Black voters want both, right? What they're trying to do, they prioritize substantive representation, but descriptive representation is kind of a secondary consideration after that. Mm-hmm. So, and the bit of evidence to support that would be Steve Cohen's kind of continued election. He got elected because he ran
Steve Cohen is a member of Congress from Memphis who represents a Black district, a predominantly Black district. Go ahead.
It might be one of the Blackest districts in the country. And what happened is he won in an open election, primary election, where there were 15 people running. He was the only white person. So all the Black vote got split, Cohen won. But then Cohen went and actively, substantively represented his district, and he got elected over and over again. Obama endorsed him, and now he's like, a forever congressman, if he wants it to be that way.
Right. All right. Well, hey, as I wrap us up, I want to thank you all for joining us. Ismail, just thank you so much for your presentation, your engagement here. I want to thank our executive director, Lisa Borenstein, for her leadership in organizing this event. We also look forward to seeing many of you next month on Friday, March 21st, with UC San Diego's Professor Zoli Heinel, who will talk about racially polarized voting. Thank you all so much.
Excellent. Thank you, Spencer.
Thanks.
Take
Appreciate
care.
you.